vision. They had ears. They could see, they could hear. They had revelation knowledge. They actually understood that their call to suffer for Jesus was an opportunity and a privilege. It was something that carried an eternal reward. And this goes back to us. This goes back to me. Are we willing to suffer for Jesus? And I don't believe a philosophical concept that we ask ourselves in church, because we know it disappears as soon as we go to Wendy's, right? Or as soon as we eat the chicken, it's gone. But I mean, really, if there was a price set before you, would you see it as an opportunity? Or would you see it as something that you want to run away from? A lot of us, we say, well, I thought I was suffering for Jesus. I mean, I came to church today. It was suffering to get up. And I give my 10%. It's suffering to do that. And I went on a mission trip a few years ago. I mean, what more can I give? What more does God want? I mean, come on, let's be real. Are we really willing? If it got expensive, if it meant that we'd be put in jail, if it meant that the gospel would cost us more than 10%, but really make demands on our life, like not owning a house or not driving a new car, driving something used, or making sacrifices in our own finances, borrowing money, putting ourselves in debt because we just know there's a need that needs to be met. Are we willing to suffer? If that suffering is going to cost somebody else, if it's going to cost your children the best, or if it's going to mean that your wife is left alone, are we willing to suffer if it means that we're going to be arrested, that we're going to be beaten? Are we really willing to lose our life for Jesus? Especially when Jesus says that those who seek to keep their life will lose it, and whoever loses it will preserve it in Luke 17:33. Is that more of a reality, or is that just a philosophical, theological thing that Jesus says that doesn't make sense? See, Jesus turns to Mary and says, do you really believe this? It's hard, but do you believe this? See, there's parts about Jesus' gospel that's so incredibly hard. We really have to try. We really have to try and face our own blindness and our own darkness. Not the fact that we can't believe it, but the fact that we just don't want to believe it. We don't want to see it. We don't want to hear it. We hide our heads in the sand and we hear God speaking, but we just keep going, wah, 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 wah. I can't hear you. Really meaning I don't want to hear. I don't want to see. Because if I hear it, if I see, I'm going to be responsible. So many people come to me as the pastor and say, I just don't have anything to do for Jesus. There's no jobs in the church. Jesus says, look, open your eyes. Take 5 minutes. Look around you and see that the fields are white onto harvest. The crop is rotting. There's more work out there that needs to be done. But there has to be a desire to make sure that we're not turned away. And this comes from a personal thing in my own life. And this is all I want to share about this trip. The most significant thing. Before I left on this trip, I was preaching a lot about facing giants. Because I knew it had something to do with fear. I knew it had something to do with facing a giant. And I thought that giant would be walking over mountains and climbing over hills and swinging from trees. I thought it had something to do with that. But God took it in a completely different direction. I believe the most pivotal point of this mission trip for me was a realization of how other Christians live. Of the things I take for granted and the choices I've never had to make. You see, because after we got into Brazil, we were looking for a way to get into the village where we were going to go to the wild Indians. And we found our way to a missionary complex. And we were hoping to get advice, assistance, a plane, something from this man. And the moment we entered into there, the man came out and he talked to us briefly. He wasn't nice. But he basically said this. He said, listen, all of you, you're in Brazil under false pretense. You've come in as tourists, but you're acting as missionaries. You don't have visas for this. I said, well, wait a minute. I don't need a visa. I'm a Guyanese citizen. And he says, really? What country are you from? I said, I'm Canadian. He said, do you know that you're in Brazil under false pretense? And as a Canadian, it's illegal for you to be here. And he says, I want you to understand this. The Brazilian government for the last couple of years have been rounding up missionaries at gunpoint. It's illegal for foreign missionaries and Brazilian missionaries to work with the Brazilian Indians. And not only do they arrest you, they beat you. They beat you. And they beat you. And there's no one to really call because you're in the middle of the Amazon and no one's going to feel sorry for you. You see, the real story about these Indians in the first place was a lot more complex than I thought. They were discovered about 7 years ago. And there was a missionary, an American, who actually went in there and began living with these people. And he was learning their language little by little and putting it into words and trying to begin to teach them an alphabet so that in the hope that one day he could eventually learn their language to the point of telling them about Jesus in a way they could understand, bigger than sign language. Apparently, after 7 years, this missionary and his family was in this village when the Brazilian authorities found out. They went in there with a helicopter. They arrested him and his wife. They burnt down his house. They blew up the runway. They took away all of the pots, the pans, the clothes, anything looking like modern technology from these Indians, and they burnt them. Because it's now illegal for Christians in the north of Brazil to have interaction with Amerindian people who are considered wild. It's part of their effort to conserve the ecology of the Brazilian rainforest and to keep these people living without the intervention of what they call Christianity. And you see, these Waiwais, they know that. They know that right from the beginning. And they knew that they were hiding from police right from the beginning as well. And they make these journeys anyway. Because for them, it's important to take the gospel to people that have never heard the gospel. Because these wild Indians, as they say, are actually their own brothers and sisters. And there's an urgency in their theology. You see, they're not educated. They believe the gospel like children. They believe that unless they preach the gospel to these wild Indians, that these wild Indians will die without the knowledge of Jesus Christ, and they're going to go to hell. You see, they're not concerned about the ecology, and they're not concerned about the environment. They're concerned about people's souls. But you see, here was the question. Here was the question that we all had to ask ourselves. Are you willing? The man said, listen, if you continue up this river, you're going to get pulled over by a checkpoint. You're going to get discovered. A white man, a black man, and a coolie man traveling with 12 Amerindians with a whole bunch of clothes. You're not going to actually just get through and say, hey, we're just here for a Sunday picnic. He says, no, they're going to pick you up. You look like a missionary. You're going to get arrested. You're going to go to jail. And I think you should pack up and go home right now. You see, we had a discussion. And I believe this was probably one of the most important discussions of our life. Myself, Joey, and Raymond, and we talked. We said, listen, we could go back to Sheldon. We could give out the clothes and we could have church and we could do some good stuff and we don't need to face this. See, Joey has a baby coming in a couple months. I think Joey, above all, doesn't need to get arrested. In fact, while he was in the bush, his wife went into false labor. That's pretty cool. She was pissed. Right? And you see, now the thought of getting arrested for 6-7 months, however long they want to hold you, and you're not going to go to trial. You see, that's not something most people want to think about. I mean, look at me. This is my second marriage, trust me. And she wasn't even happy in the first place. How am I going to call home? Or better yet, write on a piece of parchment that I'm in jail in Brazil. And my Visa card is maxed out. But you know when common sense tells you just to go home? You look into the eyes of those other Waiwais. And here's the thing. They think about us like we're the greatest Christians in the world. They think, well, if I only could understand the Bible. You see, the Waiwais have had their own translation of the Bible since 1993. But they think, listen, if I only understood the Bible the way you understood the Bible, and if I only could read the way you could read, and if I only knew as much as you knew, I could do so much more for God. You see, they look at us like we're the best Christians in the world, and they have such a high expectation of missionaries. They expect missionaries to be willing to lay down their life. And for you to turn around and say, listen, I'm afraid of jail, I'm afraid of beating, and I just want to go to Sheldon and have a nice service, but I really just don't want to face anything that could really cost me something. That level of hypocrisy is more than a little uneducated, wise faith can take.